That was loud. I am sorry. Okay, so what did we learn? Basically, that utilitarianism can get really complicated really fast in that it seems very simple in theory, but in practice, it becomes a lot more complicated. And I thought that was funny. All right, hopefully that'll be a link to it when I upload this on Canvas. Now, deontology. Deontology derives from the Greek words for duty and science. It is a normative theory regarding which choices are morally required, forbidden, or permitted, in contrast to theories that guide or assess what kind of person we are and should be. Hint, that's foreshadowing virtue ethics. So this stands in direct opposition to utilitarianism and consequentialism. One of the biggest differences is that some choices can't be justified by their effects, no matter how morally good their consequences. Some choices are just morally forbidden. So you can't murder one person to save many, because murder is always wrong. So the trolley problem does not exist in deontology because you can't kill anyone. So consequentialism, all about the good. Deontology, all about the right. So the father of deontology is Immanuel Kant. He lived from 1724 to 1804 in Prussia. He was an incredibly strict and disciplined man. The story is that people in the village that he lived in set their clocks by his daily walks. And so if you keep that in mind, it kind of makes sense that that sort of man is the one who developed deontology. So he argued that the supreme principle of morality is a standard of rationality called the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is objective, rational, and unconditional. All specific moral requirements are justified by this principle, which means that all immoral actions are irrational. Kant holds that it's imperative because its command addresses everyone who could follow it but might not. And it's categorical because it applies to us unconditionally or simply because we have rational wills. And he has two formulations of the categorical imperatives that we're going to talk about. So the first one is this idea that you have to act only according to that maxim if you are willing for it to become universal. So this idea basically is you have to first think of a statement that explains the reasons for acting as you propose. So if you are wearing a pair of super unflattering pants and you ask me, do these pants make my butt look big? And I'm like, ooh, I don't want to tell you that they do because that would hurt your feelings. So I'm like, all right, well, I can lie to protect your feelings. Then I recast that as an explanation as a universal law. So everyone can lie anytime to protect anyone's feelings. Then I have to consider whether that is a realistic law for the world. So if it should apply in all circumstances. Ooh, I don't know if anyone should be allowed to lie to protect anyone's feelings, because then you could lie if you were cheating on someone or committing adultery by saying like, well, I don't want to hurt them, so I'm not going to tell them that I'm cheating on them. That shouldn't be a universal rule. Oh, well, then I guess I can't lie to protect your feelings because I wouldn't want everyone to lie to protect someone's feelings in every possible circumstance. Context does not matter in this world. So my action would not be morally permissible. So what I should tell you is, yes, you look fat in those pants. So for Kant, there is no such thing as a white lie, and there's no such thing as context. The second kind of formulation of the categorical imperative states that we should never act in a way that we treat humans, whether ourselves or others, as means, only as ends in and of themselves. Basically, people are ends, not means. So you can't treat people as a way to get something done. They matter in and of themselves. We are to respect human beings simply because they are people. We are called to respect them because they are rational, not because they have met some standard of evaluation appropriate to persons. So that means that no matter how awful a person has been or what terrible deeds they have committed, they still deserve the basic respect as people with rational wills because they are human. So you never cease to be human in Kant's vision. And most of our modern human rights regime and human rights treaties is basically based on this idea of deontology, that because you are human, you're deserving of certain basic rights and respect. All right, then we have rights-based ethics. And rights-based ethics should be fairly familiar to people who grew up in the United States because it's very similar to our Bill of Rights and, well, it's what our Bill of Rights and Constitution and Declaration of Independence are based on. So rights-based ethics argues that there are two different ways that kind of morals or ethics come into the world. So some people believe that there is natural law. And this is the idea that first, there are moral rules founded on divine, universal, absolute laws. These are usually the Judeo-Christian laws. Second, that these divine moral laws are discernible by human reason. And third, because of their divine authorship, these rules have to be followed and can be figured out. So that's one view of rights-based ethics. Another view argues that people have rights because they have free will, rationality, autonomy, and the ability to regulate one's life in accordance with one's chosen conception of the good life. And in both of these, people kind of use a thought experiment to say that when humans are in a state of nature without governments or laws or anything like that, they still have these rights, these natural laws, this rationality and ability to figure out these ethical rules because they are people, and then depending on the two different explanations. What these two different explanations have in common is that the rights figured out from them are natural, i.e. not invented by humans, universal, i.e. not dependent on culture, equal for all peoples, and inalienable, meaning they can't be given up. So the two big philosophers I'm going to talk about that deal with this are John Locke and John Rawls. There's also other big philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but I'm not going to talk about them today. I'm trying to keep it simple. All right, so John Locke, you should recognize because he had a really big influence on the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence. He believed that men have the right to life, liberty, and property in a pre-political state of nature, and that these natural rights put limits on the legitimate authority of the state and are grounded in individual dignity. So he believes that we should have those rights, and those are our ultimate ethical foundations, and that these rights put limits on the rights of government. John Rawls came up with this idea of the veil of ignorance, and he wrote about it in his 1971 book, Theory of Justice. So this is essentially, for the veil of ignorance, his big idea for figuring out what sort of codes, morals, ethics a society should have. So imagine that you have set for yourself the task of developing a totally new social contract for today's society. How could you do so fairly? Although you can never actually eliminate all of your personal biases and prejudices, you would need to take steps at least to minimize them. So Rawls suggests that you imagine yourself in an original position behind a veil of ignorance. Behind this veil, you know nothing of yourself and your natural abilities or your position in society. You know nothing of your sex, gender, race, nationality, or individual tastes. Behind such a veil of ignorance, all individuals are simply specified as rational, free, and morally equal beings. You do know that in the real world, however, there will be wide variety in the natural distribution of natural assets and abilities, and that there will be differences of sex, race, and culture, and that will distinguish groups of people from each other. And then you come up with moral principles for how you should relate to each other from this veil of ignorance, knowing that there will be differences, but not knowing where you're going to be on the other side. And Rawls argues whatever you come up with are what moral principles should be for our community. And that governments then need to protect those rights under the social contract. As you can imagine, lots of people really disagreed with this kind of thought experiment that explains ethics, which leads us to communitarianism. So this was a big reaction to John Rawls' theory. And when we're talking about rights here, because communitarianism also is very much talking about human rights, we're also talking about ethics. So communitarians argued that standards of ethics must be found in forms of life and traditions of particular societies, and hence can vary from context to context. So this really came to a head in the 1990s during what's called the Asian values debate, where a lot of Asian government officials challenged Western-style governments, saying that Asian peoples and communities place emphasis on family and social harmony, the community over the individual, and that Western values of individualism and choice don't make a lot of sense for their societies and are not how they define ethics. And so a lot of our styles of government and that sort of thing don't make sense for their societies and communities. But also a lot of Western philosophers came on board with this as well. So communitarian ethics people argued that cultural factors can affect the prioritizing and balancing of rights or ethics. Cultural factors can affect the justifications of rights or ethics. And cultural factors can provide moral foundations for distinctive political practices and institutions. They argue that yourself, as opposed to being this like rational pre-nature being that rights-based ethics philosophers argue, they argue that the self is defined or constituted by various communal attachments. The biggest philosopher in this was Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor objected to that liberal view that men are self-sufficient outside of society. And he argued that moral good or goods that generate moral obligations on us, regardless of personal preferences, are not invented by individuals, but located within a social world which provides one's framework of value. So being nice to my neighbor, while like a general good rule or maybe my personal preference, it creates a moral obligation because I live in society with other people. And my society says and creates a value on being nice to your neighbor. So things have worth for us because they are granted significance by our culture, and insofar as they fit into a pattern of activities that's recognized as leading a good life within our culture. It casts doubt on the notion that choice, which in deontology and the rights-based ethics and utilitarianism and ethical egoism is like the biggest thing. You choose to be moral. It casts doubt on this idea that choice is intrinsically valuable and that this is a really just an individualistic Western notion. So I really like this quote, even though there's a typo in it. Even if there's nothing problematic with universalizability meant to yield a determinate set of human goods and values, any such set would have to be considered in terms so abstract that they would be useless. So communitarianism is basically arguing that even if there is universal sets of ethics, to be universal, they have to be so abstract that they basically lose meaning. So even if they do exist, all meaning in ethics and morals is really gained by the social context of where you live. So people have argued against communitarianism, stating that it is super relativistic and therefore not useful. But I kind of like the idea that context matters. Which then leads us to our last big moral theory, the simplest one, but also the hardest, which is virtue ethics, which can basically boil down to just be a good person. That's it, bottom line, good person. So in the West, virtue ethics founding fathers are Plato and Aristotle, and in the East, it can be traced back to Confucius. So this focuses on the idea of good being versus good action. So the idea is that you cultivate the virtues of being a good person. However, what defines a good person depends on the philosopher you talk to, and I couldn't really find a great summary of what a good person is. Basically, it's just be a good person. So the moral philosophies that we have covered are ethical egoism, which is that normative theory that the promotion of one's own good is in accordance with morality. In the strong version, it's held that it is always moral to promote one's own good, and it is never moral not to promote it. But you can take short and long-term views of your self-interest. Basically, being selfish is ethical. Then you have consequentialism, which is the view that morality is the consequences. But how do you define the consequences becomes a hot debate. We focused on the specific branch of consequentialism, utilitarianism. Utilitarians believe that the purpose of morality is to make life better by increasing the amount of good things, such as pleasure and happiness in the world, and decreasing the amount of bad things, such as pain and unhappiness. They reject moral code systems that consist of commands or taboos that are based on customs, traditions, or orders given by leaders or supernatural beings. Instead, utilitarians think that what makes a morality be true or justifiable is its positive contribution to human beings. The greatest good for the greatest number. However, this gets complicated when you try to define what is the good. Then you have deontology. Deontology, the right has the priority of the good. If an act is not in accordance with the right, it can't be undertaken no matter what good it may produce. So it's not contextual. Something must always be the right action to be right, which is kind of unrealistic. And people are ends, not means. So you can't use them to achieve their goals. It's about duty or doing what is right for its own sake. Then you have rights-based ethics. These rights stem from our human nature and are self-evident and or God-given because we are rational. We have rights. And it is the base of the United States Constitution. Then you have communitarianism. And the idea is that man is a social animal because he is not self-sufficient alone. And standards of ethics must be found in forms of life and traditions of particular societies and can vary from context to context. Then you have virtue ethics. This is right being over right action. If you cultivate virtuous qualities, you will act virtuously. There's lots of different conceptions of what being virtuous is, and it can vary culturally. So that's kind of the quick and dirty of moral philosophy. Obviously, you can go a lot deeper into this. And I will provide kind of a extra document with the works cited from this lecture and various sources that you can go to for extra information. I realized after I posted this that I had left off my works cited, so I will add that in a separate document. All right, going forward. So, a brief history of ethics and public administration, and I mean real brief. This is kind of just to set up the four big theories that we deal with today. So, machine politics and the spoils system. The spoils system, also called the patronage system, it's a practice in which the political party winning an election rewards its campaign workers and other active supporters by appointment to government posts and by other favors. The spoils system involves political activity by public employees in support of their party and the employee's removal from office if their party loses the election. A change in party control of government necessarily brings new officials to high positions carrying political responsibility, but the spoils system extends personal turnover down to routine or subordinate government positions, aka administrative ones. The term was in use in American politics as early as 1812, but it was made famous in a speech in 1832 by Senator William Marcy of New York. In defending one of President Andrew Jackson's appointments, Marcy said to the victor belong the spoils of the enemy. In Marcy's time, the term spoils referred to the political appointments such as cabinet, office, or ambassadorships controlled by elected officials. The machine political system was a system in which a boss, a political power broker, would get votes for someone in return for favors, usually administrative or spoils. So there are lots of famous examples of this, most famous Tammany Hall in New York City. So in the 1870s, the civil service reform movement began. It lasted roughly until the 1890s with the creation of the Pendleton Act of 1883. I'm going to repeat that again for the cheap seats. Pendleton Act of 1883. Remember this. This created a federal civil service system based on merit. Although it was only initially used for entry-level positions, it was expanded in 1946 with the Reorganization Act of 1946. They were concerned with the spoils system that reached its peak with Andrew Jackson and the corruption that had increased with industrialization. The reformers were middle-class people who felt challenged by the mass immigration that fed the boss political machines and were pushing them out of civic culture. They believed that politics was becoming a trade, dear God, rather than a calling for educated people who want to help others. They believed that the merit system would take away the meat, aka immigrants, of the machine and allow the natural leader, you can't see my hands, but I'm doing air quotes, to take their place. They called it increasing ethics and accountability within public administration, but its roots were really racism and classism. It was out of this desire for the merit system that the politics administration dichotomy grew, because it was a way to get rid of Jacksonian patronage and the spoils system. They used the split to introduce the merit system. It was kind of repetitive, sorry. However, this didn't kill the machine the way they thought it would, because boss politics turned to monetary kickbacks. Instead of putting the people that they wanted within administrative positions, they began to just require kickbacks in order for administrative officials to do their job. So, hey, you want to get that road paved? Well, I'm going to blockade it unless you kick me back this amount of money. Or saying, hey, I helped you get elected, so you have to use my contracting company in order to build that new building. So the progressives, our second wave of reformers, from the 1890s to 1911, were from the same political class as the civil service reformers, but they wanted political as well as administrative reform. They instituted primaries so the bosses couldn't handpick candidates, as well as referendums and recalls. They contributed to the separation of politics and administration by creating public authorities for public goods, creating new administrative positions. And there was the justification that there is no Democratic or Republican way to pave a street, so politics should be separated from these technical administrative tasks. Appoint technical people to technical jobs. So ethics became intertwined with an apolitical expertise. However, this did not get rid of all ethical violations. So just instituting a merit system didn't make it so ethical violations ceased to exist. Which brings us to the Friedrich Feiner debate, which really hit the nail on the head in terms of kind of a lot of the issues that we're still dealing with today. So in 1940 and 1941, two academics, Hermann Feiner and Carl Friedrich, wrote two different essays. Carl Friedrich wrote Public Policy and the Nature of Administrative Responsibility. Hermann Feiner wrote Administrative Responsibility in Democratic Government. And they were arguing about the best way to ensure accountability of public administrators. So how do we make sure public administrators stay in line and be ethical? Friedrich argued that public administrators can self-police via professional standards and technical knowledge. So basically, kind of continuing on the same way as the civil service reformers and progressives argued. So through professional organizations, such as the Bar Association and other things like that, would keep public administrators in line. Feiner argued that this wasn't working, it hadn't been working, and therefore we needed some sort of external control by elected legislators in order to assure accountability. So we needed to stop being so apolitical, and politics needed to get back into administration in order to establish accountability to the people who administrators were supposed to be representing. And then we keep going along, we keep kind of circling around these two different poles, and then Watergate happens. And Watergate, for those of you who don't know, Nixon and his committee to re-elect the president committed a bunch of ethics violations, including bugging the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Then they did a bunch of stupid things to try and cover it up, including pressuring elected officials, obstruction of justice, et cetera, And this was kind of the first time in the modern era that a president had been caught violating the law in such an egregious manner. And it resulted in kind of a loss of innocence for the United States and a crisis of faith in those in political power, which hit Feiner's argument really hard about elected legislators being able to hold administrators accountable. Because if we can't trust our politicians to have high ethical standards, how can we trust them to hold others accountable to be ethical? So that's kind of where we are. So to deal with that situation, there are four main ideas in public administration about how we should keep administrators ethical. So the first one is this idea of accountability theories. And, all right, here we go. Sorry, I took a little break. All right, so accountability theories. The first big question we have in accountability theories is, what is accountability theory? So there are two big different poles of what accountability is. But these are by no means the only options. So one is the idea of answerability. Accountability means that administrators and agencies are accountable to the extent that they're required to answer for their actions. And this means answerable in terms of to someone else beyond the administration. And then there's this idea of managing diverse expectations. So public administration accountability involves the means by which public agencies and their workers manage the diverse expectations generated within and outside the organization, which feels a lot more like public relations than ethics to me, but it is how some people define accountability. So then we have the question of who or what holds public administrators accountable. Remember Friedrich and Feiner, the argument was, according to Friedrich, professional organizations like a bar association or a professional, I can't think of another, professional administrator society, that's not a thing, but you know what I mean, would hold administrators accountable. Then you have Feiner, who argued that elected officials should have oversight over public administrators in order to make sure that they're on the straight and narrow. Then you have this idea of compliance-based accountability or performance-based accountability. So in compliance-based accountability, it's focused on the rules and procedures and focus on whether they have complied with the expectations of what an agency or what a public administrator is supposed to do. And if they do not abide by these rules, then there is punishment for a violation, and there is a determination of fault. So in compliance, it's very much oriented on some sort of compliance with a rule or procedure, not necessarily an outcome. So it's more process-based, but it's also very much punitive-based. So there is someone at fault for an ethical violation. So this struck some as a problematic way to hold people accountable because it's very much an after-the-fact sort of accountability. People have called it the firehouse mentality, where you only react to an ethical violation after the fire is broken out, essentially, after the violation has happened. So this has created another school of thought which argues for performance-based accountability. So performance-based accountability, ideally, is a form of continuous monitoring, so you avoid that firehouse idea. And it's a continuous monitoring of outcomes and not of process. So it assumes relevant information can be gathered about the outcome and that consensus on desirable outcomes is possible. That these can shape administrative behaviors relatively unobtrusively without recourse to threats of investigation and prosecution. So those are two really big assumptions that come along with performance-based accountability. So the first being that relevant information can be gathered about the outcome. This may not always be possible or the case. I know that many of you have worked or are working in public institutions, and the idea that you can always gather a lot of information on the outcome with running to privacy things or different departments within an organization stonewalling due to turf wars or some such thing is completely unrealistic. Also, the idea that consensus on desirable outcomes is possible. In some areas, this is very possible. On other areas, it becomes a lot harder, especially in human service-based organizations where it is really unclear often until something horrible has happened that maybe the outcome wasn't desirable. So in Nicholson v. Williams in New York State, a bunch of children were taken out of the home and put into foster care when women were experiencing domestic violence. The reason they were taken out was because the city had adopted a philosophy of when in doubt, take them out, based on previous experiences where they hadn't taken children out and those children had died. So they're operating under that standard. However, that outcome of taking children out, no matter what, was very hair trigger, violated a lot of basic rights of those mothers, and that outcome was undesirable. But the social workers at the time were operating under the assumption that it was better to place the children in foster care than to potentially have one child die. So then how do we establish an ethics violation in these cases? Because there are two kind of ethical ideals battling out against each other, so it becomes difficult. Sorry, I took a sip of water. So the difference between the two is that performance-based accountability focuses on the outputs or results, which is kind of utilitarian, rather than in conformance to process. And compliance-based is very much focused on the process of obeying regulations or congressional intentions, which is very much like deontology, aka the right way to do things. So then we get to the who or what are public administrators accountable to. So we can break this down into kind of four traditional realms. So first, public administrators are accountable to the bureaucratic hierarchy. So if I'm a ground level worker, I'm a police officer. A police officer is accountable to their sergeant. Sergeants are accountable to their captain. Captain's accountable, and so up on the line. That's who's holding us accountable. Then there's the idea of legal accountability. So this is based on relationships between a controlling party outside the agency and members of the organization. And that outside party can't just be anybody. It has to be an individual or group in a position to impose legal sanctions or assert formal contractual obligations onto the public administrators or public administration department. So ideally at the federal level, this would be like the inspector generals. They come in, they investigate, and then they create a report that that department is legally obligated to obey. Then there's the idea of professional accountability. So professional accountability is characterized by the placement of control over organizational activities in the hands of the employee with the expertise or special skills to get the job done. The key to this system is deference to expertise within the agency. So it basically says that if you know how to do your job, then you'll be ethical. Yeah. So then you have the idea of political accountability. So responsiveness characterizes political accountability. The key relationship under these systems resembles that between a representative, the public administrator, and his or her constituents, those to whom they are accountable, aka a legislature of some kind. So these last two kind of echo the Friedrich Feiner debate. So in this last one, you are, as an administrator, you are accountable to the public legislatures who have created the laws that technically your department is following through or acting out on. Then there's this last idea that public administrators perhaps are accountable to the general public, the people. Sorry. So this would be kind of that communitarian ideal, in that what is right also depends on who is holding you accountable, the community, the people. So what the people define as moral and good should be holding you accountable. So in our day and age, that would probably be opinion polls, as sad as that is. That would be kind of what a public official should be using to hold themselves ethically accountable. All right. Now we're going to move on to something that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, because no matter what job you have, you definitely have seen one of these, a code of ethics. So A code of ethics specifies what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviors in a particular profession. Codes of ethics kind of fall into three different realms: regulatory, educational, and inspirational. Regulatory is the one that I'm sure most of you are the most familiar with. This is kind of the do this, don't do that. It's usually very punishment oriented. It kind of lists out rules for how you should behave and specifies that you will be punished if you do not obey these rules. Then there's educational codes of ethics. And these are ethical things that you should be doing. So it's not so much punishment oriented, it's a little bit more aspirational, as in you should be providing good customer service, you should be XYZ. And then there's inspirational. So these are goals expressed in inspirational tenets and codes that are akin to the internal goods that associations or practices are supposed to advance. Basically, an inspirational code of ethics is more telling you what your particular profession values. So we're going to look at kind of the values in the ASPA Code of Ethics, which is the American Society for Public Administration that Lucky plugged at orientation, and you should have hopefully taken its Code of Ethics with you when you left. So in ASPA's Code of Ethics, you can see these underlying values in the statements that they make. So they stress that we are to serve the public, we're in public service, and we are to serve the public interest. They state that public administrators should respect the Constitution and the law. They emphasize the need for democratic processes within ASPA. They stress that we value social equity, advising superiors and peers, personal integrity, organizational ethics, and professional development. So this inspirational code of ethics is kind of laying out what they think public administrators should value in our society. So ethics codes can express the expectations of positive ethical behavior by people at all levels of administration. And they can also serve to inform people outside the profession what they can and should respect from people within that profession. Codes of ethics, such as educational and inspirational one, are very much virtue-based ethics. They're kind of like, here's how you can be a good person. And then regulatory codes of ethics are a little bit more deontological because they're focused on duties, what you should and should not do. All right, then we have ethics as a design science. And in my experience, this is the one that students have liked the most because it is the most practical, but I think it's also kind of the easy way out. So, design science. In design science, you are supposed to design a response to the ethical problem at hand that both addresses the immediate short-term solution, but also looks to the wider organizational, legal, and social context for the longer-term answers. Seems simple, right? An ethical issue exists when competing or conflicting ethical principles or values are embedded in a practical problem. So the goal is to separate the practical from the ethical dilemma. And one thing I love about design science is they acknowledge that there are many different courses of action that could probably satisfy your ethical dilemma. They recognize the many, many shades of gray within a situation, and that it's usually not super cut and dried. There are a lot of different actions you could take and still be sort of ethical. It's all about finding the best fit for your particular situation. So resolution is reached when you discover an alternative that provides an acceptable balance of your duty to the ethical principle and the likely consequences, and it satisfies your need to have sound reasons for your conduct and your need to feel satisfied with the decision. Because neither a perfect balance of duty or consequences, nor a supremely rational alternative provides complete emotional satisfaction. So resolution is often a proximate state. So the reason I said that design science is kind of an easy way out is because while it is giving you kind of an approach to ethics, it doesn't give you any of the ethical principles from which you're supposed to be judging your problem, which I think so it's kind of sidestepping the bigger moral issues. But does a great job of kind of telling you how you should approach a problem in your everyday life. So you look at it, kind of figure out what larger personal or ethical problem it is, which I think is probably the hardest part. And then you look at how am I going to fix this short term, but also be aware what sort of precedent it might set if you make this particular decision. And then you have to decide out of the many things that you could do, basically what you think is the best option. And for what is the best option, they kind of recommend using the New York Times test, which is if your decision was printed on the cover of the New York Times the next day, would you feel okay about it? So basically, it's a kind of an external pressure situation. You should pick the action that you would not be ashamed of other people finding out about. And I think this works with people who generally have a solid moral compass, but if you don't have someone with a solid moral compass, then I don't know how they're going to use design science or how that's going to help them remain ethical. Although you could argue about ethics codes as well. Like, if you don't have a good moral compass, how is that going to make you remain ethical? Also, what even is a good moral compass? Ugh, this is why people hate moral philosophy professors. All right. Anyway, so hopefully design science is basically the idea that there are a lot of different solutions to an ethical problem, and use the one that you wouldn't be afraid to see posted on the New York Times the next day.